Good evening. It's a pleasure to see you. It's been a long time since I've gazed out at other human faces that aren't entombed in little squares, constantly interrupting each other. My name is Drass. When I'm physically instantiated on the internet, I'm known as shardcore for reasons that are too obscure to go into right now. And my background is as an artist. I'm a painter, amongst other things. This is from a series called Corporate Fight Club, which is how the matters of business are settled mano a mano. And here's a more recent one. It's a painting of my wife's favorite gorilla, Tibbs. But we're not going to talk about painting tonight. We're going to talk about algo culture. Now, this is the area in which I like to hang out. It's looking at the relationship between humans and machines, and this new form of culture that exists, this new form of culture that exists between us, right? It's something that we share. Now, we can look at the word culture and see, care of E.B. Tyler, a nice bearded Victorian, that culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So pretty broad, culture. I think the key word here is man, right? Because it's not like that anymore. Culture is involving other entities that are non-human. Now, personally, I tend to think of culture as the organism. If there was a flying saucer from space arrive at night and clear our minds of culture, we'd be banging rocks in the morning. Because the culture is the thing. The culture is instantiated in each and every one of us and shared between us. But if we stopped speaking to each other, or as I say, had an amnesic ray, the culture would disappear. The culture needs us to exist, but the culture itself is the organism. And culture now lives not only amongst humans, as I said, but amongst machines. Culture lives here. This is a data center in the middle of the desert, which contains Facebook. And in many true senses, this is a repository of culture, like it or not. It's the activities of man that, as E.B. Tyler describes, and it sits there in the data center in some humming machines. And if we look at our relationship with culture, we have to go back to Google and Eric Schmidt from 10 years ago, who said that it would be very hard for people to watch or consume something that has not in some way, some sense, been tailored for them. So this is a decade ago, acknowledging that there is a barrier between what's being talked about and you, and the choice of what you see in your feed, be it your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed or whatever, is determined by a machine. So we have this setup where we have baseline reality. There are various arguments about whether that's really there or not, but we're going to take it for granted for now that we have a baseline reality. On top of that, we have direct perception, which is the stuff that we can see. So those of us in the room right now, are actually having a direct perception of me giving a talk, and I can see your faces, and I can see the nuances. That feels like a thing that is pretty close to reality. It feels pretty real. I'm looking at it. I kind of believe that you're all human. Now, when we go away from this room and talk to our friends and go, I saw this fantastic talk by Eric Drass, as you all know how to do, this is a layer of reportage, and if that person is trusted by you, you believe that they're actually describing the thing that they saw, and we're pretty close to the truth, one step removed. And on top of that, we have a layer of opinion, which is someone who didn't come to the talk, heard someone else talking about it, and made their mind up and said, that guy's just a wanker, right? An opinion is detached from reality to some degree, but is still, I kind of trust the people I'm talking to, the community of other individuals talking about stuff. And then culture lives above this, in this layer of pink, crispy bullshit, right? Which is this abstraction away from reality, where we talk about the things of the world without necessarily directly perceiving them. And this has become more complex, right? So we've got reality out there, and we have this new layer of machine perception, machines looking at the world, machines looking at the data that comes out of us and building its own representation. And once we've got this machine reality, we've got this layer of algo culture on top of it. So just as Eric Schmidt was talking about this distinction between what you can see and what's been tailored for you, we now live in an algo culture bubble where we are interacting culturally with something that has been fiddled with to some degree. And that's kind of where my interest in the artistic aspect of it comes from, is I'm kind of intrigued to know what's going on in this space, what's happening between reality and the culture that we're consuming, where the machines are getting involved. So this is an example of a style GAN network trained on supermodel faces. So these faces do not really exist in any sense. They've been gathered from a huge collection of other photos. And once you've got them, you can start messing with them. So let's talk a little bit about machine interference, shall we? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this event. Right, so this is Rod Penton, apparently, who was a lawyer who called into his Zoom call and left his cat filter on. Right, so there's an obvious bit of machine mediation going on. This guy didn't know, and he's like, oh, I don't know how to turn it off. Please help me. It is me. I'm a cat. And we all think it's just funny. It's like, oh, look at that buffoonery. You know, it's clearly not him. Or this other one a bit more recently, which I really enjoyed, which was an American state senator who attended a court hearing from his car and set the Zoom background to be his home office while he was driving in the hope that they wouldn't notice that he was actually out driving. Right? So again, I love this, right? I love this bit of machine interference that's going on here because you can see the edges of it, right? You can see where it's gone wrong. Now, obviously, we're very familiar with machine interference, right? So Photoshop has been around for a long, long time. But our perception of these celebrities in the newspapers or online are always airbrushed and treated. You don't actually get to see what she looks like. In the interest of balance, here's Harry Styles undergoing a similar kind of process, right? So already we are being given a form of the truth that's been machine mediated, and we just take it for granted. And we don't think about the off day when they actually look like real humans. And obviously this can have quite a dramatic effect on people's perception and body dysmorphia. Even in our homes during lockdown, how many people have discovered this setting in their Zoom, which is a little slider that smooths you out, makes you a little younger. Right, now there's a bit of interference going on that you're choosing to place between you and your co-Zoomer. You're putting this little tweak. I just, a bit hungover today, I'll just slide it a bit more. And it's taken for granted. Snapchat filters are another classic example. And this is where you start seeing the bias of the machines, the bias of the algorithms in what happens. So this is a beautifying filter. And what does it do? Well, it narrows the nose, lightens the skin, and pushes people towards an ideal of beauty that's very Western and very white and very dictated by the users of Snapchat. It's like, well, if you want to look like that, you need to look a bit more like what we consider to be normal. And that's kind of disturbing, right? It's a plaything, but it's not truly representative of everyone who might be using it, because these things come out of tech bros in California. So part of the reason that we do a lot of work with faces is twofold. One, because they are a good computer science project. Quite a lot of the research around neural network stuff is driven by, one of the data sets they use is faces. So again, this is the same model of supermodels. And one of the reasons for that is that we're pre-wired to be interested in faces. Huge proportion of the primate brain is dedicated to perceiving and understanding the faces of other people. We really want to know how you're feeling or whether you're a threat. And the brain has evolved to see that. And we've, in fact, conversely evolved faces with white sclera in the eyes so that we can actually see people's eyeballs clearer than other primates. We still have eyebrows so we can express to each other. And that's a huge part of the brain is dedicated to doing that work. And so as a result, when you start messing with it, with neural networks, you're already got quite a strong affordance with the person you're targeting. So let's start off with talking about deepfakes. So what is a deepfake? A deepfake is think piece catnip. Here's some example headlines. What is a deepfake? This video technology is spooking some politicians. Deepfake videos and the threat of not knowing what's real. The world isn't ready for deepfakes. Here's what you need to do. Deepfakes videos could destroy our trust in society. Deepfake porn and other ways AI can ruin your life. I'm sure some of the people in this audience tonight have had their lives ruined by AI without any porn interference. Generally, when we talk about deepfakes, we're talking about transferring one face onto another. So in a way, it's not fakery in the sense that excites me particularly. It's a disturbance, right? It's an unexpected transgression. There's a lot of deepfake videos of Nicolas Cage or Elon Musk. People like to put famous faces on. This one, in fact, is not using deepfake technology. This is old school Photoshop. But it produces a particular feeling when you see it, particularly if people of our generation who may not want to conflate those two ideas. Practically speaking, deepfakes uses a pair of autoencoders with shared hidden units. If you want to know more about that, we can talk about it in the pub, but for reasons of non-nerd sanity, I won't go too deeply into it. But effectively, you train one network to copy from A to A and one from A to B, and you share the hidden units between it. So as it learns about one face, it learns about similar features in another. And this allows you, when presented with face A, to generate face B. So about 18 months ago, I got approached by BBC 4 to make a deepfake for them. Now, it's a law of the land, I've discovered, that the first thing they do is ask a production company, who go, we've no idea. And then they asked BBC R&D, and they went, no, we don't want to do that. They tried to find an external production company, who said, oh no, that's all about porn, we won't do it. And then sooner or later, someone gets my phone number, which seems to happen again and again. If there's something slightly wrong to be done with machines, sooner or later you're going to get my number. And the task in hand was to turn this dancer into Ian Hislop. And so this is an example of a classic deepfake. So this face into this face. And the first thing you've got to do is extract the faces. So part of that is tracking the location of the face within a frame. A lot of this stuff is automated. And that is the mask that you're going to project onto. And at the other end, you do the same thing with your target face. So I was lucky enough to have Ian around to pull stupid faces at me. And if you've got enough faces of both the dancer and Ian Hislop, you've then got enough data to train these models. I learned an awful lot about deepfakery doing this. It's a bit more of an involved task than you first expect. Most notably, that dlib, the library that finds the face mask, is a bit hit and miss. So you have to edit certain frames, or you get very warped creatures. But anyway, after some wrestling and a few weeks of GPU time, we came up with a dancing sequence. I can't make it any louder, unfortunately. So that was an interesting technical exercise. I say I learned a lot about it, and the technology itself has come along a long way since I did that a couple of years ago. And there's even effectively single-shot learning deepfakes now. We can give it a single image of your target face, and it will do that work for you. Whereas this one took tens of thousands of images. My personal interest is usually in more fakery. So when Bernie appeared with his mittens, I couldn't help but
still came up and caught her hand to the side, harping and fought her when she dived down low. Soon may the wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go.
So that's using a different piece of deepfake, one that actually I find a lot more interesting, which is WAV to lip, where you can actually feed in a video on the one side, and you can feed in just the audio on the other, and it will manipulate the face of each frame of the video to match just what the audio is doing. And one of the reasons I particularly like it is it's very forgiving, and it really doesn't actually have to need to be a face. Here's an example of some of them. Now, obviously, it's not just video that's being faked. We're faking voices now. Some of you will have noticed the story about Chef Bourdain having a documentary made about him last week, where he hadn't actually said some of the words that they wanted him to say. So in between, they cut in deepfake voice of him reading out a particular passage from an email seamlessly into the production and didn't tell the audience, which caused all sorts of concerns, because, hang on a minute, this is a dead guy. Something creepy about that. But you didn't find people complaining about it when they made a hologram of Tupac, right? There's a degree of things that you do to certain kinds of people that is allowable. This story I particularly like, which was the first time they managed to make some money out of deepfake voice, where you call up your bank and have the voice of the CEO demanding a transfer right now, God damn it. And, you know, sooner enough someone will do it, because that's what happens. It's social engineering hacking, but with the added advantage of being able to fake the voice as well. We're going to see a lot more of that. I think, for me, the most fascinating aspect of deepfake is not what it can do, but the fear that it can instill. So I found this story a few weeks ago, which is a whole conspiracy theory claiming that the death of George Floyd was faked. And in fact, it was an actor who'd had the face of the cop deep-faked onto him before the clips were released. And, you know, with nice technical-looking blah-de-blah-de-blah to the right audience, people believe that. So the idea that that could be done is, in fact, more powerful than the technology that does it. So one of my projects from a year or so ago looked at some of this face stuff, Celebrity, which was about breeding celebrities together. So if we take these two lovely people, we can find their faces inside a neural network that's been trained on lots of faces. And then we can move in parameter space inside the network and find a spot in between. So 37% Daniel Radcliffe and 63% Angela Merkel. This stuff really appeals to me. I really like this edge where you're just confused. It's really tweaking parts of your perceptual system to go, that's almost right, almost wrong. There's a couple more here. Will Ferrell and Barack Obama, or Elton John and Elon Musk. Interesting little blend. So let's go back to this idea that we've got machine-mediated reality. We have these tools around to mess with the information that's coming towards us. And if we refer back to this diagram, we've got our reality and our machine perception, our machine reality and our lovely algo culture. And then we have people like this who are kind of running those systems. I like to think of him as the man with the most punchable face in tech. Some of you may disagree. Now, I don't think actually he's fundamentally evil. I'm sure many people here have met people like Zuckerberg, and you know what it's like. You know how nerds can get. But I think his systems allow other actors to do devious things with them. So, they didn't anticipate Bob Mercer turning up and using the advertising targeting system of Facebook to manipulate elections. And so Bob Mercer used Facebook as part of his web of connections that gave us such delights as Brexit and the Trump presidency. So the machine and the algorithms are built for one purpose, but if you are perhaps not so morally minded, you can use those same systems to manipulate other things. And when we talk about bots, we're often talking about these kind of bots, right? Twitter bots that will be amplifying a signal with the same message is being delivered by lots and lots and lots of accounts to give the impression that lots of people are talking about it. And if you track them down, they're all even using exactly the same words a lot of the time. But if suddenly a tweet, these guys are all following each other and all liking each other's tweets, you can see a sense of activity around a subject that is entirely machine created. But, other people manipulate the market with their power in the same way, right? What Bitcoin dropped, was it 10%? Because Elon sent a single tweet about it. I mean, that's the power of the system. That's not a bot interference. That's just one individual dicking around, having an enormous effect on the community. So part of the problem is that machines can be biased in the sense that they can produce outcomes that are not appropriate for all people. And often that bias comes from the training set that they've been given, particularly for deep learning models. They're effectively function fitters. They will learn whatever it is you throw at them, and they will reflect it back to you. So if you train your neural network on a biased data set that says, everyone who lives in this part of town is more of an insurance risk than the people who live in this part of town because of some historical data, then the insurance system perpetuates that idea. And the people who live in this part of town don't get such a good deal as the people who live in this part of town. And often the people who live in that part of town are the brown people. But it's okay, it's not fundamentally racist. It's just using available data. And those models, those inferences, those biases get baked in because they're built on non-representative data. One of the areas that's very hot for computer science is image recognition. The ability to spot what things are in camera feeds or photos. And this is an example of a pretty state-of-the-art from a couple of years ago. So it can spot and label each of those things in real time as they're going past. One of the interesting aspects of it for me is that the ImageNet dataset required over 25,000 workers to annotate 14 million images. So they have the system to categorize that. So you may think, oh, AI is clever and doing all this thing automatically. But this particular example involved loads and loads of people looking at pictures, drawing boxes around cars, providing all that data to the system that then learnt it, generalized it, and produced this model. Now, machines aren't like us. They're not fleshy. They're not blessed with two eyes and a brain and an emotional system. And so they learn things differently. They may behave in a way that seems human-like. They may spot a car and go, that's a car. But they're not seeing a car in the same way as we do, because they've not grown up in a biological body. So these are some examples of what are known as adversarial images. So you can show these images to that ImageNet model and say, what am I looking at? And it will go, oh, it's a king penguin. Or that's a starfish, or a baseball, or an African grey parrot. So these images, when presented to the systems, are mislabeled by the system. And to us, there's no fucking way that looks like an African grey parrot. But to the machine that's only been learned on this trained data set, this is a hole in their thinking. This example is probably better. So this 3D printed turtle is identified as a rifle in any orientation. So you can imagine carrying this turtle through an airport and being wrestled to the ground, right? For carrying a plastic turtle, because it's made of adversarial images. And most of the time, see, rifle, rifle, rifle. And obviously this has other ramifications. Google, a few years ago, released a system to automatically classify photographs. So you can upload all your photographs, uses an image recognition system, and says, here's all the cats, here's the dogs, here's all the gorillas. So because the data set was so biased by only pictures of white Californian twats, I had no idea that black people existed in that kind of way. And you know what Google's response was? It wasn't to fix it, it was to remove the category of gorilla from their labeling system. So internally, that bias and that classification still exists. They just don't show it to the user anymore. And obviously, this stuff is troubling, right? Because you may be in a position of privilege that many people aren't, and those decisions, those algorithmic decisions, are being made automatically behind your back. Right? The truth is, we stink of data, right? Everything we do leaves a mark. You know, the thousands of pings that have gone off from my iPhone here in my pocket just during this talk identify my location, amongst many, many other things. And obviously with the Pegasus news this week, if you have access to this supercomputer in someone's pocket, you've got access to their whole life. And that whole life is based on the data that they're spewing out, either consciously or unconsciously. China recently, they've introduced heads-up displays for the cops. So they can actually, this is an example of a cop surveying a station platform and identifying suspects with a little arrow over their head as they look around in a heads-up display. In some states in America, they are trialing a similar kind of social score that's available to the cops at the point of intercept. So as you wind down your window, say, show me your license, sir, they'll run the license and go, this guy's a wanker on Twitter. Or, you know, this person spends far too much time in this location. All this information about your life that's been harvested digitally is available to the officer at the point when they knock on the door. So one of the projects more recently I've been working on is something called AI identity, which is trying to tease out some of these biases from the systems. And some of you may have heard of the CLIP model. This was built by OpenAI to effectively solve that image labeling problem that we just talked about. So rather than getting 25,000 people to look at 14 million images, you just build something to read the internet. And you'll find a picture of a cat and the word cat nearby. Or you'll find a picture of Boris Johnson and the words Boris Johnson nearby. And by looking at an enormous amount of data, I can't remember the exact number, it was something like 4 million documents, you can build this model that says, is this a picture of a cat? And CLIP will come back and say, I'm 85% sure it's a cat. Or say, this is a picture of a car. You know, I'm 98% sure it's a picture of a car. And it works really well. It works really, really, really well. But what it's implicitly done is learned the internet. Now, as we know, the internet is not necessarily the most savory or unbiased place in the world. And so I used this model alongside a face generation model to classify faces. So you can use the error signal from CLIP to control the learning of another model. So you can basically make a picture and say, does it look like a cat? And it will go, no, not really. And one model changes the picture, and it says, oh, it's a bit more like a cat this time. And you keep doing that thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and you get oh, this is a picture of a cat. So this particular model is against faces. And I was intrigued to know what this CLIP model had learned about us culturally. So you can use this and say, make me a picture of a Belgian man. And it will, through its error propagation, come to a face. I don't know many Belgians, but it's got a Belgian vibe to it. French woman. Already these things are coming back in my, I wouldn't call them prejudices, but my expectations as a European of what my fellow Europeans look like. It's kind of coming back. And remember, this model knows nothing. No one has taught it what French women look like. All it's done is read the internet. Often you get these cases where it's picked up stuff from the background. So there's a lot of red, white, and blue in American imagery. I like German man, and he's got a great face. I'd like to go for a pint with German man. But obviously, it doesn't always work. It doesn't work solely with kind of national identities. It does it for occupations, right? So a construction worker. Again, I think much like the American woman, it's pulled in information from the background and put him in high vis. Or, you know, what does a computer scientist look like? Here it is. It's trying to work it out. We'll get there in a minute. I like that they're in a computer room. You can clearly see they're in some sort of server room while they're doing it. But yeah. So you can kind of see the fight that's going on here, right? So it's getting an error signal of that's not quite a computer scientist. Keep trying. And it ends up asymptoting on this as an archetypal computer scientist. Now, these examples are generally pretty funny, but they expose the fact that this information is inside the system if you're willing to look for it. And lo and behold, if you ask it for a terrorist, you get a terrorist, right? So you can imagine a less liberal country putting this kind of system at the borders, and as you walk through, making an assessment about which class you fit into. Are you actually Belgian or not? Are you a terrorist or not? And these decisions have been baked into the system. These biases have been baked in purely by reading the internet. No one came along and said, terrorists have beards. It just learned that by looking at it. So you can use the same model, the same clip process, these days in much more abstract ways. So by using it with a transformer model, VQ-GAN transformer, you can now ask it to make pictures for you. And it will generate imagery purely based on the text prompts that you give it. And if any of you have been following the kind of AI art scene on Twitter, it's everywhere at the moment. So I'm just going to show you a couple of those just to show you quite what happens. So this is Boris Johnson and COVID, which he's one of my favorite victims, Johnson. He's actually really well represented in the data set. You can always get a bit of Johnsonness out with only the merest label. Also use it on philosophy. My background is a philosopher, so here's a Nietzsche quote. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, and if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. And I like how it's picked up both Nietzsche and some monstrousness there. And so this is a bit of code of my own design, so it's effectively being asked over and over again to create the image, but in each step it's slightly rotated and zoomed, so you get this kind of hallucinatory spiral. And in fact, here's a good one. This is Boris Johnson and Hieronymus Bosch. So I'm personally very delighted with this as a piece of art. It allows a whole new way of interacting with these models. So remember, under the hood, this is the same model that produced the terrorists and the Belgian men. It's a system where you just ask it for a question and use the error signal to continue to try and find the image that it thinks is appropriate. I've actually been in discussion with Brighton Digital Festival about doing one of these perhaps as a large-scale projection, a kind of end-of-days, endless horror projection. So keep your eyes out for that one if you're looking for a good time. So I'll end with just a brief thoughts on what this kind of means. We live in symbiosis with the machines now. There's no two ways about it. They're not going away unless you're going to go and live in the woods in a hut. It is what it is. And machine intervention has been around in unexpected ways for quite a while. This is the flash crash of 2010, where automated trading systems suddenly decided, through reasons that have still yet to be fully unpacked, to dump $20 million worth of stock in a nanosecond. And then they re-recovered their stock positions, I think, 45 seconds later. So the whole stock market dropped by 1,000 points and recovered based on some algorithmic interaction that still to this day no one understands. And here we are 11 years later, and automated trading is bigger than ever. People move their exchanges to be closer to the internet so they can execute these trades faster, far, far faster than any human could ever dream of making those decisions. And those guys are controlling the financial market. I think what it is that we're all centaurs now. Centaur is a term that I've been picked up from the world of chess. There's a class of chess players who call themselves centaurs because they play as humans with a chess computer alongside. And the chess computer advises them, and they may or may not take their advice, but it's a hybrid between a human and a machine, and they tend to play better than each of those things individually would. So a chess computer and a human playing collaboratively play a better game than either of those things individually. And I think that's where we are. You know, anyone who's got access to a Google search bar is already way more powerful than any other human that's lived before. We have access to an enormous range of information, an enormous range of digital services that were incomprehensible even 10 years ago. And so we're all, effectively centaurs. And, if you've been frightened by it, good, because I'm trying to frighten you a little bit, but also think about the fact that culture is changing. So the cultural organism that I referred to at the beginning of this talk is based on what's in the heads collectively of all the people. And when the Lumiere brothers made this film of a train arriving at a station in, was it 1895, they used to go around France and show this film, and people would run screaming from the projection tent because they believed a real train was coming to hit them. Because they'd never seen a giant train, life-size train made out of light, coming out of a machine. It's terrifying. Their individual cultural representation could not comprehend that. But we adapted, and now we kind of laugh at that. Oh, that's crazy. How can you be scared of a film projection? And I think that's the only thing that we can do as a culture. Is culture itself will adapt to this stuff. Culture is this stuff now. The best thing we can do is to become educated, is to understand when we're being manipulated, and when we want to step in or out of that kind of manipulation. I don't think we're fundamentally doomed, but we're in a time of accelerated change. And that could be scary. But if you really want to know how to deal with this shit, ask your kids, right? Because they've grown up with it. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much. Thank you. Wow.
Wow. Maybe. I'll use this one. Thank you very much, Eric. Brilliant. If you're not familiar with Eric's work online, shardcore.org, he has so many pieces, so many works of art, like he had in this presentation, that entertain, educate, and disturb. There's plenty of that. Exactly. And I had a conversation with Eric before, and he graciously agreed to have a conversation now with us all about these ideas that he's now stirred up, certainly in my brain and hopefully in yours as well. And I want to start with our remote audience and check in with them and see if they have any questions for Eric. Jeremy?
Yeah, fantastic. So, Eric, first of all, lots of rounds of applause going on from the remote audience over here. We've had a great chat about the meaning of evil, bots, AI, and all things to do with bots and AI, really. But a couple of questions, aside from the fact I want to know what your real opinions of Boris Johnson are, but I'll save that for the pub. A couple of questions from the online audience. So this is a question from Alistair. Regarding the use of machine learning for law enforcement, how much of the risk can be mitigated through strong education about the limitations of such systems? Or will humans always end up being too trusting in the computer?
Well, interesting question. Firstly, education. So if you know that that cop approaching you has access to information that may be used against you, shut the fuck up, right? I mean, that goes from, interactions with the police generally. Is it the case that these systems are entirely out of our control? Well, they kind of are, but we have a legal framework. And that's usually where the buck stops, right? Is the legal definition of what you are or are not allowed to do. And one of the, for me, one of the more amusing aspects of this stuff is that people are very worried about algorithms and robots taking over their jobs. And people think, oh, it's going to be the truck drivers. They're first up against the wall. It's not. It's going to be lawyers. Legalese is one of the areas of domain that really lends itself to machine learning. There's a lot of strictly defined words laid out in very particular ways that is ripe for machine learning. And so I think we're going to be in this interesting state where the on-the-street police officer has access to one set of information, but the lawyer who defends you in court has a supercomputer behind him to try and get you out of it. So I think it's going to be the test of the legal system rather than our actual direct influence over the data.
Brilliant. Hope that answers your question, Alistair. We've got a question from Helen as well. What do you think is the solution to being better at eliminating bias in AI?
That's a big one. Well, firstly, making sure you've got representative data. So what you're training your system on needs to represent the world that you want it to learn. And unfortunately, as many data scientists here will know, first thing is you're lazy, right? There's a big chunk of data, I'm just going to shove it in because blah, 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 blah. A lot of work is done in data cleaning, right? Half the job of a data scientist is cleaning up your data so a machine can eat it. If your cleanup takes away that slightly dodgy record because it's incomplete, automatically you're biasing the data set, right? Because it doesn't fit your model because of the representation of this particular person, means you probably don't put it into the training set. So even by accident, bias can be introduced. And the other end is obviously just to test it properly, see what it does. One of the problems is that capitalism does not have any inherent ethical component. There's no reason to be good when you're making money. And people who are making these systems are primarily driven by making money. And unfortunately, the engineers sitting down writing these algorithms or solving these problems are maybe empowered to do that piece of geek work, but they're not empowered to influence the direction of the company as a whole. And if the company is driven capitalistically, there's nothing to come in there and say, you know what, this is a bit dodgy. If those people who live in, Whitehawk aren't able to buy anything at the shops anymore, so, oh, fuck it, I'm not one of them. And that stuff just happens in this, there's a lot of talk recently about ethics in AI because it has such an impact, but I don't think anyone's really solved the issue of how you get a sense of ethics to intervene in a primary capitalistic society. And AI is just one of those things where it doesn't work.
Excellent. Thank you for your questions from the remote attendees. And now here to our live attendees. Does anybody have a question for Eric? Right over there then. Oh, Jeremy, could you hand it?
Yeah, and just thinking about your previous comment about removing bias from your data set. I think actually that's really interesting because in actual fact, as data scientists, we can remove bias from our data set. If I'm training an insurance model and I want to get rid of the male-female dimension, I can get rid of that. I can get rid of that dimension, and I can partially, maybe not fully, remove that bias. That's actually, in one way, much more powerful than we actually have other ways of moderating our own bias, right? So I'm a human being, and I have prejudices. If you were a woman up there giving a talk, I may have an initial judgment which is different, right? And I don't have any way of getting rid of that bias apart from to cognitively recognizing the bias and then moderating it. So in other words, the difference is I'm not changing the data set, I'm responding to my own reaction, if you like, and I'm adding another bias on top. So it's less of a question, it's more of a comment that was stimulated by your answer. But,
You're not the first person.
Yeah.
I'm only a woman on Thursdays, so that's why you see me this way. I think you've revealed it yourself in your question there. So you can make a choice to remove a dimension in your data because you think it's the right thing to do. Conversely, your pointy-headed boss really doesn't want you to remove anything from your data because that's data is power, blah, 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 blah. Now, these systems are, neural network systems are, as I said before, just function fitters. They will try and model whatever you throw at them. And the biases can be quite subtle and not obvious until the system's in production and it starts mislabeling people. Part of the problem is that machine learning is very much in vogue, and it's come along almost inevitably following the wave of big data. Because the first thing is, fuck, there's loads of data. Let's collect it all. Let's get big data. Let's get all the data. And then, as data scientists, you're suddenly faced with this enormous pile of data that you don't know how to interpret, that you don't know how to analyze. So you just shove it at a network and learn it. And then magically, when you wait long enough, it does something. And most of the time, it seems to do something appropriate. So it's great. Shove that system into production. Look, it does what we expect it to. The bias is baked in and cannot be undone. Because you can't look in that black box and go, it's this set of neurons that have made it slightly racist. We'll just take those out. No, you can't. Not when you're operating in a multi-thousand dimensional vector space. So the fact that these are kind of obscure black boxes is also part of the problem because you can't unpack them. So that the only thing you can do is look at the data you're putting in. And as I say, it's fundamentally an ethical problem, right? Can I make my data set representative and appropriate to the moral and ethical framework of the society which it's presenting to? And often that is in itself biased. So not really an answer, but more of a comment.
Thank you, Eric. And we have a question here from the room.
I like the comment you made about how society, we have a broad range of ways that we present culture, right? And just taking a data science sort of look at that, is there a way to sort of reduce the complexity of culture with morality? Do you think that's possible?
I'm not sure that culture needs to be simplified. In fact, one of the issues around deep learning is that it tends to make the edges a bit fuzzier. So outliers are kind of thrown away implicitly in the training methodology. So if you make culture simpler, you're almost inevitably going to be leaving stuff off. And generalizing, machines that generalize, like neural networks, are basically filling in the gaps. So I could look at every individual in this room and work out the similarities between them and make a model of this audience, but it wouldn't capture the nuances and it wouldn't capture the outliers, right? Chris's enormous beard would be not in the data, right? Because he's unlike all the others. So over thousands of epochs of training, Chris would not be represented inevitably because there's very few people who look like that. And so that's where you need to try to address the bias when you build the data set. And that has to be in some ways positively done. It's like, I just need more people with beards in my training set. Otherwise you end up, mislabeling people as gorillas.
Thanks again. And another question here. Here, go ahead, Brian. You need to hold the microphone close to your mouth.
Hi. How far into the future do you envisage us being faced with something like this person does not exist, only they're animated and they're actually real?
Well, there's several companies offering that right now. And you can approach it from different ways. You can approach it from a neural network, deep fakey kind of way, or more likely you're going to do it from a computer graphics manipulated model. I think one of the interesting developments recently is, I think it's either Facebook or Microsoft Halo, where they are putting cameras internal to the headset that take an oblique shot of your face. And they're using that data to control an avatar of you somewhere else. So it reduces massively the amount of bandwidth you have to send, because all you do is you send the morphing shape of the mask, and then at the other end, you recreate an exact simulacra of that person, or in fact any other person, which is the implicit bit of it. But it means that you can start sending much less data, and at the other end you're like, oh, this is just like Fred sitting next to me. Well, it's not. None of that is Fred. That's a reconstruction of Fred and a small amount of data being pumped through. So I think that stuff already exists, and it's only going to get more seamless. My favorite phrase is that whatever you see, whatever crazy stuff you see in AI art today is going to be on your phone in 6 to 18 months. It's almost inevitable that whatever it is that seems out of this world is going to be in your pocket pretty soon.
Again, thanks. And one more question here.
Hi. That kind of segues into a question I was kind of thinking about, but couldn't articulate until you just said it there. A lot of these things seem to be in kind of like 2D space, where everything's just kind of a picture or a deep fake of, I don't know, just a poster. How long do you reckon it will be until it goes into the 3D space, where we start dealing with kind of mesh grids and 3D?
So people are already doing stuff with meshes and GANs. And obviously for the kind of intermediary level, there's stuff that uses depth maps. So learning a depth map and then building an image from a depth map is quite an interesting thing that's turned up in the last couple of weeks. So I can take a photograph, a depth photograph, which is basically a grayscale that just says how close and far away everything is, feed it into a network, and it will reproduce the photograph that fits that depth map. And then obviously that depth map is rotatable. But the mesh stuff is, it's coming on, and it won't be long. Usually it's the paucity of data, right? If I had thousands and thousands of meshes of people talking, I'd be in a good place to make a AI modeler, but there's not so much around where there are thousands and thousands and thousands of faces. There's no reason that a GAN has to make pictures. It's an adversarial network, right? One of the networks is trying to make something, and the discriminator is telling you whether it's any good or not. And that stuff could be insurance data, right? It could be whether you were let into a nightclub or not, right? It could be anything, and it just learns by training itself, which is the power of it, is that it's kind of another step removed from that bias problem. It's like, it's not about me massaging the data anymore. I can just leave it to it, and it will find the optimal solution. And so I think the 3D stuff is fascinating. I've got a friend actually who's a potter who's interested in getting a 3D ceramic printer, and we were talking about the idea of producing 3D objects, kind of visual GAN stuff, but in three-dimensional space out of clay. So it's on the cards.
And one more question from the room. Nigel?
Hi. Interested in your opinions on legislation. The European Union about to legislate around the use of AI. How's that going to affect the future? Is Europe going to become quickly different? And are we going to become more American? And how does it compare with completely unfettered AI in China?
I think the genie's out of the bowl as far as AI is concerned, and there's only so much legislation that can be applied. And I think China is an interesting example because that's a culture in which mass surveillance is accepted. And if that is part of your cultural framework, you can do amazingly horrific or fascinating things. Like the fact that each individual has a social score that they're constantly protecting, that if you get a low enough score, you can't even get on the train anymore. You lose access to services based on an algorithmic computation. So, I mean, you can, on the one hand, China, free for all, because they're, one-party state. I very much applaud what the EU is trying to do. I think they did a great thing with GDPR, right? I think in a way that only a structure that large can do. But I think it's an increasing problem that in this kind of accelerated culture, that as things are happening way too fast for legislation to keep up with. So whatever they may think is an appropriate constraint on artificial intelligence today in 2021 is already 5 years out of date. So I think I think it's very hard to legislate against. It's not a very cheerful answer, but unfortunately that's what I think.
Hi there. As an artist, I wanted to ask you something, right? With machine reality being informed by whatever is happening out there, and of course feeding itself, and then having algorithms creating art, both music and imagery and what have you, in how long do you think there will not be actual artists anymore producing work? I mean, if what I'm seeing and how I'm influenced from my social media tells me what I should like, and at the same time something similar is producing new art of the same type, where does that leave human creativity?
Firstly, I'd point you at Spotify. So Spotify has a subdivision that is algorithmically generating music, so they don't have to pay artists. So when you have that playlist and it plays the next tune, it will play, 3 techno songs to you that you've chosen that are your artists. Then it will start throwing in algo stuff that Spotify has made itself, that more or less fits the genre and keeps bubbling along, and you keep coding, but they don't have to pay any artists for that because it's close enough. So I mean, that is already here in terms of that edge of culture. But I do think there's a strong desire for humanity amongst humans. And that's what makes artists special, and you want to see a human exploring themselves and their world and their relationships with others in a way that you can relate to. And I think as an artist making a lot of this visual stuff, particularly this clip stuff, it produces amazing, amazing, amazing work that is indistinguishable from human work. But I know it wasn't made by a human. And in fact, the backstory of the artist with the brush is part of what gives it its authenticity. I'm actually reached almost full circle with it. So as I showed you at the beginning, I'm a painter as well. And I took up painting because I was a geek and would spend my life writing code and then watch it get turned off a year later as stuff would go bust. And realizing that my entire life was going past in this pursuit of data generation and coding, but there's nothing to show for it. Particularly anyone's familiar with startups, they don't last around very long, right? And you find myself going, shit, I've got nothing to show for who I am. So I'm going to put down this keyboard and I'm going to go and paint a picture. And it was actually as a result of I want a physical thing that exists, that's out there, that was made by me and didn't involve me going to a keyboard. And it's only as a matter of time that I've come back from painting into coding, into AI stuff. But the approach is fundamentally artistic. And so I want to see what this stuff does, and I want to produce things that are pleasing and informative to me. And hopefully people look at it and go, oh, it's that guy with the funny hair who made it. And he's a human, so I like where he's coming from. But as you say, practically, the works generated by machines are going to be indistinguishable. And I have teenage kids, and to prepare them for the future, I say, whatever it is they're teaching you now is going to be irrelevant by the time you're in the workplace. The most powerful thing you have is your creativity. That is the one thing that a machine really can't take away from you. And your ability to think on your feet and adapt, like that form of creative thinking, is the last thing that we've got to hang on to. And I think that's why artists kind of, hopefully, right, are going to be slightly protected from that, because that's kind of what you want. I kind of want that painting to be made by a human with his own set of flaws and problems, rather than a machine. So yeah, I very much sit on the fence about that one. I think the chewing gum content, like the easy Spotify stuff, the algo-generated memes, all that stuff, that's already done. And in fact, I've got a talk coming up with the copywriters conference to talk about GPT-3, because copywriting is over. Right? That kind of fluff that you see on a web page talking about a product, no human needs to write that ever again. And you know what? No human's going to read it either. It's this kind of circle jerk of algorithms reading computer-generated text. That's a big chunk of the internet. And so, yeah, certain quote-unquote creative industries are going to be doomed. But I think the true soul of the artist as a human that you identify with, we're all going to want to hang on to that, right? He says, hopefully.
Oh, thanks again for that great answer. I'd like to check in on our remote attendees. Do we have any more questions from remote? One second.
Awesome, thanks. Sorry, I just needed the mic there. First of all, lots of praise from the remote audience on the talk, on the event. Everyone's really enjoyed it.
I love remote people. I've learned to love them over the last 18 months. They're the best kind of people.
And I promise you that, well, as far as I'm aware, there's no bots on the remote audience anyway. It's been quite a hit, this remote event, in Alistair's household. He asked a question earlier. They've had it on the big screen, and now his wife's got a question too. And this is a good one as well. So you mentioned China's use of machine learning to identify suspected criminals. Are you aware of any Western countries, especially Britain, that are thinking of using such technologies?
Have you met the GCHQ? A subject very close to my heart. I think the way we are surveilled automatically is of great concern, great concern. And a classic example is at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the first laws that they enacted was to hand over cell phone data directly to the government without oversight. So since for the last 18 months, the government has been able to locate every single one of us to within 5-10 meters at any point in time. And that was quickly written into law because COVID. Now, interestingly, that's exactly the technical infrastructure that South Korea used to run their track and trace system. So they didn't install any apps. They just used the cell phone data and said, you and you are next to each other and you test positive. And you know what? They had very little COVID in that country. Instead, we spent £27 billion on a non-functional track and trace system. Meanwhile, taking all of that data and storing it in GCHQ, much the same that our browsing habits are allegedly being recorded at the domain level, right, and have been for quite some time. So everything you click on is also being logged against your record. So yeah, this stuff is being used by the police forces in this country. They are not explicitly putting heads-up displays on the police officers, but they're certainly driving around with CCTV cams that are doing exactly that facial recognition algorithm off the top of a van. And in part of the horrific evolution of predator and prey, the model's now being trained to identify people who are wearing masks. Because obviously that was a big problem before at protests, people wear a mask. Now everyone's wearing a mask. Shit, we better solve that problem. And in fact, they're building new models now to identify you by that amount. So yeah, it's here. They're just not wearing it on their faces and giving you a public credit score. Anyway, happy, good times.
Well, I'll interject one question here. What is your most optimistic outlook given all your information about machines inserting themselves between us and objective reality, and as flawed and biased and complex as they are, and yet being machines and being technical systems, having such gravitas and having such strength over our objections?
You were looking for an optimistic answer.
Obviously.
Yeah, I mean, so much of culture is now being produced or mediated by machines. You can't ignore it, and a lot of it's fun. Right? A lot of it's crazy. The deepfake videos on the internet make me laugh. Right? There's stuff going on here that can have sinister uses, but generally doesn't. I think my point about the George Floyd deepfake cop is like that's the bit where it's interesting, where the idea has got into culture and people are using it to manipulate the reality far more than actual fakery. I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in with the deepfake stuff is trying to make that manufactured authenticity. But the problem is that the footage you would want to get of Boris Johnson is in character. So if I then went in and got him to say something else, you'd know that it was fake. It's like, oh, well, I kind of saw that clip on the news. He'd never say that. Whereas if I had some great footage of Boris Johnson disheveled, with his tie off in his house off camera, and then you deepfake some stuff in, that's much, much more powerful. So quite a lot of it is about the aura around the work that makes it threatening. And access to stuff that is threatening is actually harder than you think. And the key difference is education, right? If you look at that and go, Jesus Christ, that's clearly a fake, as many people now do, it becomes easier. You've already dismissed it. But people who've never seen a deepfake before, much like the French who'd never seen a train before, can be freaked the fuck out by it. So optimistically, yeah, there's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of crazy, crazy shit. But unless you can see the whites of their eyes, don't believe a word of it.
Beautiful. Thanks again, okay. Eric. So we're drawing this event to a close, and I want to do it with something, a small story I wanted to start with. We've got some technical difficulties, so we'll end with it instead. 18 months ago, we were meeting every other month. Then on March 25th, we were supposed to have our in-person meeting. This was obviously when COVID was hitting, so we had our first cancellation. On that very day that we were having our first event cancellation, Eric posted this video that I'd love to play for you now.
How long I'm stuck inside? 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 In this little house of mine, everything moves placidly, even though outside my door, unfolding catastrophe. Been inside too long, you see, the walls are closing in on me, and everywhere I look I see a new thing looking back at me. Faces in the carpet, faces in the chairs, faces staring out at me from underneath the stairs. And I don't trust the piano with its creepy toothy grin, and don't you even talk about the creature in the bin. How long I'm stuck inside? 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 I'm not known for my agape, I ain't no social hub. It's not like I want to go dancing, I just miss the pub. Now everywhere I look, there's these faces looking back at me, filling up my brain with their words of mad conspiracy. I'm trapped inside this cupboard, and it's falling off a cliff. Maybe I should use this time to find a killer riff. My memories of the outside world are getting pretty hazy, or maybe I'm just down with Prince and going fucking crazy. How long am I stuck inside? How long am I stuck inside? How long am I stuck inside? How long am I stuck inside?
Shardcore.
And the answer is no more, until now. And we're finally back together, and it's been absolutely great to have you all here in person, and to the remote people, the wonderful, fantastic remote people. Thanks very much for tuning in. But we'll be clearing out of here soon, but not very far. For those of you interested, or alcoholic, we're headed over to the pub just across the street, Old Albion, where interested people with thoughts still stirring and spinning around in their heads can share them over a pint. Again, thank you very much, Eric. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you to MPB for your brilliant support. Thank you, Brandwatch, for your support, for the refreshments, and we've been enjoying all evening as we were waiting for technicalities to get sorted out. Yeah, thank you again. Goodbye.